So let us begin. Please rise for our Pledge of Allegiance. And this time, our November guest speaker, Walter Carter, will lead us in the pledge.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you very much. Thank you again. I don't know what we would do without Starbucks, Lexington Center, who supplies our coffee and our caffeine to keep us all alert and asking such good questions at the end of our program. Thank you for the donation of the baked goods to go with the coffee. Thank you for your donations to help us with our modest operating budget. Okay, we have a few announcements here. First, if you have not already done so, just a moment, we would really be grateful if you would fill out this brief member questionnaire. There are copies on the table right next to the blue Bedford VA box. What is this questionnaire, you ask? Well, page 1 asks you a few questions about your service. We'd kind of like to know what branch of the service you served in, and when, and for how long, and what did you do, and what was your rank, so that we could have a picture of just exactly who we are as a group, or whether you served in the service or not. We've had about 100 people answer this already, and if we get a few more responses, I will put together a little presentation so we can all see just who we are as a group. Page 2, turn it over, has some questions about programming. It wants to know, what programs did you especially enjoy? We're always on the lookout for new and interesting programs. We work way ahead in trying to get our programs together. And we would love your ideas and suggestions. If there are some that you particularly liked, let us know. If there are some a topic that you'd really like us to cover and we haven't done it in quite a while, let us know. There's a question that asks you if you have a story to tell. We would love to sit down over a cup of coffee and talk about your potential story. See if it makes sense, see if it's feasible, and we would do all we can to help you put it together. There's also a question that says, would you like to help us plan and organize these programs? You know, they don't just happen by themselves. They take a bit of work. And if you have any kind of an interest, we would welcome that, because we really always need fresh ideas, new ideas, creative ideas. If the same old people keep putting together programs, pretty soon it's going to just be same old, same old. It's going to get stale, it's going to get boring. So we need some new blood. So I'd be grateful if you would grab a survey, take 5 minutes here before you leave, or take it home and bring it back next time. Now, a week from today is Martin Luther King Day, Monday, January 15. There are a whole host of events on that day, but there's one event in particular that we'd like to tell you about, because it involves a certain group of veterans, formerly homeless veterans, who now live on the campus of the VA hospital in Bedford. And Sophia Ho just happens to be in the audience. Many of you will remember the wonderful presentation that Sophia gave. She grew up in China. Her father was a general in Chiang Kai-shek's Nationalist Army, and she told us all about her childhood growing up in that kind of a life. So Sophia is in charge of the program that is being held next week, and she is going to tell us just a little more about it. Sophia?
Thank you. Thank you, Linda. Martin Luther King Day of Service was established 4 years ago a group of us said we want to do something following Dr. King's spirit and all that. So I've been working with some others in charge of senior programs. In the past, we served lunches in the 3 villages. This year, we decided to do something different. We are inviting all the seniors of Lexington to come to a party with music and some snacks and just be together. It's from 1 to 3 at Brookhaven. Brookhaven offered us their beautiful auditorium. But since it's day of service, we always try to do something for some group. And my first suggestion was our veterans. I always want to do something for our veterans. So I called Linda. Linda put me in touch with Gina, who put me in charge with this group called Bedford Greens. It's on the VA Hospital compound. About 69 units of housing for former homeless people with substance abuse and all that. So we are very happy. We got contact with them and they gave me a list, a wish list, everything from toothbrush to shaving cream, towels and mugs and anything. They all welcome. They must be new. So we thought we put out list. I have some. Bill Kennedy wrote all of us a letter, very nice. If you haven't received it, there's more flyers over there, get it. So please come. We want you to come for a fun afternoon, and at the same time, we can collect something for our veterans in Bedford. Thank you very much.
Hopefully you all received the email just this past week with more detail about that program and a very detailed shopping list. Think of it as a housewarming present for these veterans who are now living in these beautiful brand new apartments. They can use just about everything. So anything that anyone cares to donate will be extremely welcome, and Sophia and her team will deliver them over to Bedford Green later that day. Yes. So thanks so much. Now, another interesting pioneering effort that is going to happen. The Lexington Veterans Association what?
If we can't come on Monday, is there a place to drop off the donations?
Thank you for the question. Sophia.
Here, take them up.
Yes. If you drop at my house, or if you want to send a check to me as well, that will do too. How do I tell you? 351 North Emerson Road in Lexington. 351 North Emerson Road. All right. Or if you forget, contact Linda. She can find me. That'd be very, very nice. Thank you. We want to make a big collection for our veterans there.
Yes, it really would be very impressive if we could make a giant collection. And there were so many creative ideas listed. Movie tickets, you know, cards to Panera and Dunkin' Donuts and dishwashing liquid, you know, anything. So that's great. Well, anyway, the Lexington Veterans Association is going to do a collaboration with the Lexington Historical Society. We're very excited about this. How many people have ever heard of or have ever attended one of the Historical Society's Cronin lectures? Yes? I'm thrilled. Great. We are going to co-sponsor the upcoming Cronin lecture, which will be held in March. And the program is wonderful. I'm not going to talk about it. Somebody else is. We considered it and wanted to have it as a program here for this group, but soon agreed that the correct venue for it was the Lexington Society and the Depot, and that it should be offered to the full community as an evening program. So here to tell us more about it and to ask us for our support is Sue Rockwell, I'm sure Sue is well known to most everybody in this room. She is a member of the board of directors of the Historical Society, and she is chairing the event. And she said, because nobody else, I'm teasing. God love her. Sue Rockwell is going to tell us about this.
Thank you, Linda. Yes, we are very excited about this opportunity. The Cronin Lecture Series, by the way, was named for Neil Cronin, who many of you might have known. He actually enlisted in World War II, but he was thrown out after about 3 weeks when they found out he was 38, which was considered too old. So he became
38 again.
he became a warden in Lexington, and a very, very good one, keeping everyone out of trouble during World War II. Anyway, March is Women's History Month, so we are very pleased to be sharing this program, which will honor the women of the greatest generation. Those women who served in World War II, either on the home front or on the foreign shores. And the group that will be presenting it is called the Just Peace Players. They will be presenting first-person stories from women who were involved during the wartime. They have actually published 4 books of collections of these stories, and they will be drawing from the stories in these books that evening. It's March 9th, Friday evening at 8 p.m. It'll be at the Depot, which is fully accessible to everyone. We do have hearing assist devices, and yes, we have heat, in case that's still a problem in March. Anyway, this program has been presented at other venues, but we have a little bit of a twist on it that we think will be really special. Not only will the actors be reading some of the oral histories, but we will also have a former Lexington resident, Rosemarie Sauerman, who will come and share directly her story of growing up in Germany during the war. She lived in an apartment building. She saw Jewish families in the apartment building disappear overnight. She has a very, very powerful story to tell, as do most of the women that we will be hearing from. So we hope you'll come that evening. We know that you'll learn quite a bit about the women's roles during World War II, and we hope we can share this with you. And we thank you very much, and thank you, Linda, for giving me this opportunity.
And thank you so much. So we will be giving you updates and reminders of this periodically. We hope we fill the hall and have a wonderful crowd for this program. It should be just a terrific program. George Burnell has a very interesting announcement he wants to make. It has to do with a complimentary service that is available to veterans, and that's always something of interest. So let's have George tell us about it.
How many of you have one of these things? So, I'm getting to a stage where I don't walk as good as I used to. And having been in the Air Force rather than the Army, I don't march as well as I ought to. So I stumble a bit. And in mentioning this to my primary care doctor at the VA, about 3 days later this shows up. So if I stumble, I push a button and I have 911 on the other end, and they start having a conversation with me. It's free. It happened overnight. It was easy. Hooking it up was easy. And interestingly, This is designed really to go with your home phone, because that one on the 911 end identifies you accurately. I don't have one of those. I have a cell phone as my home phone, but it has a base station. And when I call now, I get not 911 in Lexington, but I get it out in Framingham somewhere. But this has a GPS connection. They have my location. The new 911 regulations that are being implemented will now bring me up on the board in Lexington. So whether you have a Verizon home phone or whether you have a cell phone, home cell phone, these things work. And for those of you who don't know about it and might want to have that kind of protection, I can tell you that my wife is very much happier when she's not home to know that I have some means of communication. So it's free. Talk to your primary.
Thank you, George.
Good to know. We always appreciate people who have good information, who want to share it with the rest of us. And at this time, I always ask, are there any other announcements that anyone else has that they would like to share? Okay, then one other item. We also mailed you this week our speaker schedule for the next 6 months, for spring of this year. We have hard copies. If anyone wishes to take a hard copy with them, over on the table next to the VA box. And the VA box, I can see, is piling up. Thank you for your continuing donations. They're always much appreciated. Okay, let's get to business. Thank you. Time to introduce our speaker. So let me tell you about Bob Began. Bob Began grew up in Lewiston, Maine, and he always had a passionate interest in the Navy. His guidance counselor insisted that he was better suited for a business career, however. So he was directed to Babson College. After graduation, in 1965, he found himself drafted into the U.S. Army. That's just how things work out. After a career with St. Regis Paper Company, working in a number of management positions in a number of locations,
Speak up.
to work on his passion, which is naval history. He's been focusing and specializing on the loss of the USS Quincy since 1993. He located and he interviewed a dozen survivors. He has met and corresponded with many family members, collecting papers, photographs, and memorabilia in the process. The sinking of the USS Quincy is a tragedy that never should have happened. The ship fired the first rounds of battle in the Guadalcanal offensive. She was caught unawares and unprepared. She was fired on point blank by multiple ships and sank in 45 minutes. The Quincy is a prime example of mistakes, errors, oversights, good planning that turned out to be ineffective, misperception, poor judgment, and hubris. All these things cost the lives of 389 crewmen. To the Navy's credit, they immediately recognized what was wrong and set about fixing these mistakes so future ships did not suffer the fate of the Quincy. In telling the story of the Quincy, Bob stresses the human side, how the gallantry and the bravery of the men of the Quincy who were lost actually saved countless future lives by the lessons learned from their tragic fate. It's a compelling story. And here to tell it is Bob Began.
Thank you, Linda. Turn it down a little bit. You don't want me in charge of technology. This is a fantastic library. I like libraries anyway, but Lexington is over the top. I mean, my compliments.
Thank you.
I'm going to tell you a story about the loss of the USS Quincy. It was not the brightest spot in the history of the United States Navy, but it's real history and it warrants retelling. At 10 minutes to 2 in the morning of August 9th, 1942, searchlights from Japanese cruisers illuminated the Quincy as she patrolled the waters off Guadalcanal. 2 minutes later, a salvo would strike her aft on the main deck. In the next 45 minutes, this magnificent ship of 10,000 tons, measuring nearly 600 feet long, would be transformed into a flaming wreck, and at 2:38 a.m. she would sink in the waters off Savo Island. Of her crew, 389 men would die, and 147 would be wounded. This is her story. June 19th, 1935, the Quincy is launched at the Fall River Shipyard in Quincy. There was a crowd of about 5,000 people, celebrities, dignitaries, well-wishers, military people, and school children, all looking on this beautiful vessel as she awaits the start of her career. Former Secretary of the Navy Charles Adams would hail her as one of the finest ships of her type in the world. The ship's sponsor, Catherine S. Morgan, she's the daughter-in-law of the financier J.P. Morgan, smashes a bottle of champagne across the bow and says, "I christen thee Quincy." At 1:40 p.m. It took the ship 45 seconds to slide down the ways into the Fall River. The launch master would record in his records, quote, "In general, a good launching." From the time her keel was laid in 1933 until her launching in 1935, Quincy would be the latest. She would represent the most technology, the latest weaponry, the latest engineering concepts that the United States Navy could draw upon. She was truly a state-of-the-art ship. She was launched before radar. Radar was still somewhat in the infancy. She's a heavy cruiser. Her mission is to do the following. She can escort convoys. She can sustain combat with equal size or larger ships. She can do shore bombardments. 1936, she is everything you could hope for as a naval vessel. She's also an answer to a growing threat, a global threat by the navies of Germany and Japan. These navies are growing considerably. The Quincy is going to be able to handle any kind of threats by them, or so we think. At her launching, this will show you how times change. Prior to her launching, a collection was taken up in the city of Quincy, and every school child, public, parochial, private, every school child was allowed to donate 1 penny, and only 1 penny each, for the purpose of buying a flag for the officers' wardroom and a gift for the wardroom, which turned out to be the history of Quincy. She also had a couple paintings done by this very prominent marine artist, Charles Vining Smith, and these paintings depicted early 1800 nautical scenes. Years later, when they found out the Quincy was lost in action, the artist did 2 more paintings. They were exact copies of these paintings, and they are still in the Crane Library in Quincy. For her commissioning, she needed, well, it cost $8 million, a fairly reasonable price by today's standards to build the Quincy. We got a ship 588 feet long, a little under 2 football fields. She displaced 9,400 tons. She had 8 boilers and turbines, and they could drive her 4 shafts, her 4 screws, at a maximum speed of 32.7 knots. So she's fast, she's got good engineering capabilities. The main thing she is, she's a warship, and her main weapon is her guns, her 8-inch guns. She has, you can see them here, there's 2 turrets. Each turret has 3 8-inch guns, and then there's an aft turret. Main weapon, 8-inch guns. She also has a secondary armament of 5-inch guns, and there are 4 5-inch guns used on either side of the ship. These are fighting off aircraft, shore bombardments, ship-to-ship weaponry. Again, we're ready for aircraft, we're ready for anything. The Quincy also carries aircraft. She has scout planes which are on catapults, and they can be shot off the ship. They can fly ahead, seek out the enemy. They can be used to guide the ship's fire. They can be used to do rescue work. They can do reconnaissance. And how they, I mean, it's pretty simple. They're shot off on a catapult, and when it comes time to retrieve the ship, the plane just flies along, and there's a sling, and the plane comes up on the sling, and then the entire thing is picked up on a crane, and she's put back on the ship. The latest technology again. This is the Quincy. She's at the Four River Yard. She's being fitted out. Between the time she's launched and the time she gets commissioned or formally accepted by the Navy, she has to undergo a number of tests. There are a lot of things that have to be proven, and once the government accepts her, then she'll be commissioned. Here's the Quincy. She's a cruiser. She's one of 8 of the New Orleans class. Heavy cruisers in the American Navy were named after cities. Destroyers were named after naval heroes or marine heroes. Battleships were named after states. So, the Quincy, over here is her sister ship, the Vincennes. She's about 6 months behind the Quincy in terms of completion. What is amazing is when I look at this picture, both of these ships will sink within 2 hours of each other at the same engagement. Again, she's getting closer and closer. Here are the main guns. Here is the bridge. This is where all the decisions are made. This is where the captain would be. He would be leading, basically driving the ship. He's in charge of it. Here's a better picture of the guns. These guns have a range of about 12 miles. The doctrine, the philosophy of the Navy in the late 20s, certainly well into the 30s was, when we actually engage the enemy, it's going to be like a long-range event. You're going to have our fleet and the enemy fleet, and basically we're going to fire away at each other, and it'll be attrition. We'll try to wear them down, ultimately weaken them, but it's not going to be close combat. It's not going to be close infighting. It's going to be somewhat controlled. That logic prevailed in World War I. American cruisers are not going to carry torpedoes. Now you have submarine torpedoes. You also have surface torpedoes, and surface torpedoes are launched from the top of a ship, above the waterline. The concept of torpedoes it had some merit, but the American Navy said, you know what, we don't need them, we're not going to use them, because by the time you get so close to have them be effective, you're well within range of the enemy's guns. So we, as a very, very consistent policy, did not put surface torpedoes on cruisers. We had them on some destroyers, but cruisers did not carry torpedoes. Who's going to man this ship? It's going to take about 75 officers and 750 men. And the hierarchy, again, the top of the peak is the captain. He's the ultimate authority. Below the captain, you have the executive officer, you have the seasoned, experienced officers. You then go down to the junior officers, ensigns, lieutenant junior grade. Those are your commissioned officers. You have the enlisted men, about 750 men on the Quincy. And the hierarchy of the enlisted men is men who have been in the service, men who know their trade very, very well, experienced. They are petty officers. Petty officers are like the Navy's version of sergeants in the Army. They've been around, they know their job, they're used to getting the job done. They can tell other enlisted men what to do. Then you have the new recruits. These are men that are just basically, a lot of them are kids. They're just getting into the Navy. But that's the hierarchy of the crew. Here's a picture. These are the catapults, which will launch the planes. Here's the number 2 turret. Over here are the 5-inch guns. Over here are the searchlights. And these searchlights were critical because that allowed you to seek out and find the enemy at night where they were. Now, it was a good news, bad news scenario. If you turned your searchlights on before the other person, or if you did it too soon, they knew where you were. So you had to use them with extreme discretion. But it was the only option at the time. This is the bridge and the superstructure here. It's pretty small. It's pretty uncomplicated here. When we see some pictures of the Quincy's adversaries, you'll notice a completely different configuration of the ship. Here she is. She's on her way to the Boston Navy Yard. She has gone through the various tests, sea trials. She's getting ready for acceptance for her commissioning. This is a picture of her off the coast of Rockland, Maine, just prior to commissioning, a handsome-looking ship. Here she is, being commissioned. You can see the Marine detachment there. I forgot to mention the Marines. She had a Marine detachment, about 50 Marines. The Marines would stick to themselves, basically. Obviously they lived on the same ship. They had their own quarters. They would serve to keep discipline ashore. They would be the policemen. They would serve as orderlies for the captain. They would man some of the anti-aircraft guns. She had about 50 Marines. So at the commissioning, you've got the Marine detachment here. You've got commissioned officers here. You've got enlisted men. Here's the Old North Church over here. She's now part of the fleet. Love this picture of her. Here are the, these are the cranes. The aircraft would be there. You can see one, but I have some closer up pictures. There's the aft turret. She's painted light gray. It's peacetime. Life is good. 1936, we're working our way out of the Depression. There are not a lot of jobs for young men. Number 2, nobody really travels. You grow up in a small town, you stay in a small town. You see recruiting posters saying, join the Navy and see the world. And these have a huge draw on you because you can learn a career. You can get 3 meals a day and a place to live. You can travel. You can get shoes. You can get a lot of things being in the Navy. And you get to go places. You get to go to places you'd never think of going to. And you get to write letters home to tell the people back in Texas or back in Vermont about strange cultures and beautiful scenery and everything. And you get paid for it. And the best part of all, you're serving your country. You're part of a great team. You're on a ship. There's camaraderie. You have the Quincy baseball team. You have the Quincy boxing team. You have sports teams. You have ice cream. You have movies. It's not a bad gig. And you're also part of the United States Navy. And everybody knows we have the best ships, and we have the best officers, and we have the best weapons, and we are the best, and nobody can defeat us. So it's pretty good in peacetime. Here are some officers on visiting the pyramids. You know, a long way from the ship, but that's okay. Here are 4 very happy young sailors just coming out of a bar in South America, all obviously in a good mood. It was a good place to be. This could be the Quincy, but I must confess, it's the Vincennes. But they're identical. She's going through the Panama Canal. Here's the Quincy, another sister ship, the Tuscaloosa. They're rounding Cape Horn. This is really, really rough weather they're going through. There's a lot of water pouring over this bow. During the late 30s, the world witnesses a growing buildup of armed forces in Europe, Japan, the United States. Now, the Washington Naval Treaty of 1933 tried to control the size and the number of capital ships. Part of this was we don't ever want to have another horrible war. Well, in the Washington Naval Treaty, simplistically speaking, the results were they said, England and America, you can have 10 capital ships of this tonnage and this size. Japan, you can have 6. You can have 5 aircraft carriers, England and America. Japan, you can have 2. The rationale for this was, well, the United States has the Pacific and the Atlantic, and England has this great global empire, so you need a lot of ships. Japan, you've only got a little part of the Pacific. This did not win a lot of favor in Japan. What the Japanese did was they started building ships very, very aggressively and in complete secrecy. And the one thing the West did not know was, what are they really doing? What are the details? What's the tonnage? What's the weaponry? Blah, blah, blah. The world is it's headed towards hostilities. 1931, Japan invades Manchuria. 1937, Japanese troops invade China, the city of Nanking. 200,000 civilians are killed by the Japanese invasion. It's called the Rape of Nanking. The Globe had an anniversary article about 2 weeks ago, I think, on it. Europe, the Nazis are looking at the Sudetenland. They're looking at Austria. They're looking at Czechoslovakia. Armies are growing. Italy's looking at North Africa. Mussolini's eyeing the Northern African territories. All of these expansions are turning out to be excellent training grounds for the forces involved. It's a good chance to test doctrine. It's a chance to test out tactics. It's a chance to see how effective this kind of plane is. And what's happening is it gives inexperienced troops, it gives them experience. And the lessons learned in the late 30s come in pretty handy for the Axis once hostilities break out. We had our own assessments. Linda mentioned preconceived notions. We, the Westerners, the United States, England, we had our own conception as to what the other guys could do, what they were capable of. And it's mind-boggling to me that these were not opinions held by buck privates or new recruits. These were held by senior naval and Army and Marine leaders. Couple of them. Upon hearing that the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, General MacArthur is alleged, this is MacArthur, to have insisted that, quote, there must have been Russian pilots, as the Japanese were not capable of an attack like that. Singapore. Singapore is Britain's Gibraltar of the East. A British officer was quoted as saying, I do hope we are not getting too strong in Malaya, because if so, the Japanese may never attempt a landing. And upon hearing of the Japanese landing in Malaya, the governor of Malaya replies, well, I suppose you, the Army, will have to shove the little men off. American assessment of the Japanese fighting man. Physically, the Japanese is a mixed race of all shapes and sizes. He's mostly an ignorant villager, trained to fight to the end. While an inferior type to the civilized Western nations, he believes himself to be immensely superior to anything on earth, so he does not surrender freely and is eternally disgraced if taken prisoner. He is entirely treacherous and has no sense of a sporting instinct. He will attempt any number of tricks. Japanese look at the Westerners. A pamphlet issued to all soldiers read, when you encounter the enemy after landing, think of yourself as an avenger coming face to face at last with your father's murderer. Here is a man whose death will lighten your heart. You know, with these beliefs, it's no surprise that the Japanese were so brutal to Allied prisoners. This is early December 1941. You have a Christmas tree on number 2 turret. They have the holiday spirit. The Quincy was actually in Cape Town, South Africa. And she had just finished escorting a convoy of troops who would be ultimately, British troops, who would ultimately end up in Singapore. I know a number of you know when and where this is. December the 7th, 1941, the attack on Pearl Harbor. This is Battleship Row. These are American battleships, the Tennessee and the West Virginia. They're on the bottom of the harbor. Ships completely on fire. This is the British surrendering Singapore. December 7th, Pearl Harbor. February the 15th, England surrenders Singapore. It's the largest defeat ever suffered by the British Empire. This surrender results in over 130,000 Commonwealth troops becoming captured by the Japanese. Over 1/3 would die by the war's end. March 11th. Here's another picture of the British surrendering. I got to tell this story. So I gave this talk in Wellesley, I don't know, 3 months ago. And it was the lights were off. And I show this picture. And then I go to this picture here. And this person in the crowd says, can I see that picture again? So I go, which one? He goes, no, not this one, the other one. So I go back to this picture here. And he goes, yeah. And he stands up. He's an elderly gentleman. And he's crooking his neck and he's looking and he goes, yeah, that's him. That's my brother-in-law. And he's pointing to this guy. And he says, yeah, he was the Japanese interpreter at the surrender of Singapore. And I go, my first thought was, My second thought was, wow. And I said, well, how did he survive the war? And he says, yeah, he did. He said, because he was stationed in China, so that he really avoided the onslaught in the Pacific. But it's like 75 years ago. How many people in the picture in this? Anyway. And then a week later, he brought me some newspapers, which basically substantiated the fact that he brought some Japanese newspapers printed in England. I mean, they were printed in English, depicting the various victories of the Imperial Japanese Navy. So you never know who's in the audience. This is the Americans surrendering in the Philippines, May 8th, 1942. Over 15,000 Americans and Filipinos surrender. They are going to be forced. Here they are again. These American prisoners. This is the start of the Bataan Death March. They had to march 65 miles. If you hesitated, if you fell, that was it. You were bayoneted. There was no mercy. Any personal possessions were taken. This is where the rubber hits the road. This is where we're starting to realize who we're dealing with. Again, the Japanese look with great distaste upon the concept of surrendering. Because the American battle fleet, which was the battleships, that was our main weapon. The carriers were coming up in stature, but the battleships were the main offensive punch we had. Because the battle fleet of the Pacific is lying in the mud, the next size ships are heavy cruisers. And so they are taken from wherever they are, and they're all funneled to the Pacific. Now, the Quincy spent 1939, 1940, and parts of 41 in the Atlantic. Convoy duty, neutrality patrols. But once hostilities break, she's assigned to the Pacific. But before she can go to the Pacific, she has to be refitted because there's a whole new style of warfare that's really becoming apparent, and that is enemy aircraft and surface ships that don't have a lot of air protection are very, very vulnerable. And we're learning very quick that unless you have control of the air, your ships are really in jeopardy. Churchill, with all of his bluster and his huffing and puffing, said that he was going to send over the British Prince of Wales. It was a great, very symbolic ship. The Prince of Wales and the Repulse. And once the Japanese see those two, they're going to stop. They're not going to invade Malaya. Well, the Prince of Wales and the Repulse sank one afternoon, both capital ships. The Japanese lost 18 pilots and airmen, and the British lost those two ships. So attack by aircraft is paramount. So the Quincy goes to the New York Navy Yard to be refitted. She's going to have more anti-aircraft protection. She's going to have more light guns. She's going to beef up around the guns. There'll be more steel protection. And she's going to have other changes. Here she is, 1942. This is looking, you're right at the very bow looking aft, the two turrets, the bridge. Now these little smidgets here, 1, 2, 3, 4, they were describing what the changes were. For example, one was 1.1 inch guns. Another one was something on the pilot house. They were blocked out for censoring purposes. But it just shows you she's going to be there for 2 months on the refit. Here's a picture looking forward on the port side. These are the anti-aircraft guns. There's one here, one here. There's 4 of them on this side. Here are the spotlights. Here are the 2 stacks. These are the planes. These planes don't have aluminum bodies. They have canvas bodies. There's not a lot of moxie to them. But you can see they're on the catapults. Here's the boat deck. They had a lot of wooden lifeboats. At that point, the Navy still carried wooden lifeboats. That's going to change. Here's the planes again, a little bit lower. You can see down here. There's some there's like a practice machine for loading the 5-inch guns, and some of the men are just drilling, learning how to fire it. These crates up here are fresh vegetables. This is all the way at the back on the stern. This is an anti-aircraft gun. There's one here and one here. They have 4 barrels. They were 1.1 inch, and they call them Chicago pianos because they sounded like a fast piano. They were lousy. They were always jamming. They were very cantankerous. They really weren't what we needed. As the war went on, we came out with 40 millimeter guns. Sir?
Yeah, it appears that the decks are of wood,
Yes, sir. Yeah, teak decks.
so they burn pretty well.
Well, as in retrospect, everything burned well, but you're right, they did. They did. This is right up here, this little structure. These aren't portholes, they're little slots. And this is called Command 2 or Battle 2. So that if something happens to the bridge and the command structure gets wiped out, then command shifts to Battle 2. Over here, side note, is a light cruiser, the USS Juno. And the Juno had the sad distinction of, well, she sank with tremendous loss of life. She also, among her casualties, were 5 brothers from one family, the Sullivan brothers. In the 30s, it was considered good policy to have brothers serving on the ship. I mean, the Quincy, there were at least 15 pairs of brothers. There was one family where there were 3 brothers, two of whom killed and 1 wounded. Once the losses became that extensive, the Navy said, no more brothers. So she's going through the refit. Her crew is going to be increased to 750, from 775, 800 men to a little bit over 1,000. May 30th, 1942, she leaves New York to go to the Pacific. This is my favorite picture of her. She's on an island, Tonga Island. This was taken shortly before the invasion of Guadalcanal. And there's a fella right here that I interviewed. He told me that was him. And his name was Dan Galvin. He was from Melrose. And I said to him, Dan, that had to be one hell of a complicated message, flying all of those flags. He goes, no, they were just wet. We were drying them out. So it's like, oh, okay, Anyway, I love this picture. She's just a handsome ship. This was probably a week before the invasion. Geography lesson. This is New Guinea. Over here is Australia. These are the Solomon Islands. These are the Solomon Islands right here. What Japan was suffering from what they called the victory disease, in that everything the Japanese did, it worked out well. They might have had a setback at the Battle of Midway where they lost 4 carriers, but for the most part, everything the Japanese did really, really worked out well. So that their level of confidence was through the roof. What they had hoped to do was to capture New Guinea and capture the Solomon Islands so that they could basically expand their control to blockade or to cut off Australia. And one of the thoughts was, if we can isolate Australia, then maybe we can get the Allies to agree we can keep what we got, we won't go any further. That was actually one of the thoughts they had. So to accomplish conquering New Guinea and the Solomons, they are going further and further south. Now here is the island of Guadalcanal, right here. In May, middle of May, we still have aircraft surveillance. We have patrols that are basically coming out of Australia and everything, and they're just monitoring the traffic and everything. And they discovered that the Japanese are building a landing strip on Guadalcanal. And they put together a plan to invade Guadalcanal because the further the Japanese go, the worse it's going to be. They don't have tremendous resources. At the time, America is torn between building up for the invasion of Europe. You got the European front or the Pacific front. And the Pacific did not get all of the resources they felt they should have. But decisions made, we got to stop them. We got to stop them somewhere, and we got to do it sometime. So Guadalcanal becomes the location of our first offensive step in the Pacific. The island is wet, steamy. Malaria is widespread. The population consists mostly of native Melanesians and a scattering of European planters. Thick jungles, mangrove swamps, jagged mountains, and fields of razor-sharp jungle grass cover the island. It is far away from whatever world Americans would know. Annual rainfall, 126 inches. She's 5 degrees below the equator. It's a miserable place. Jack London, the author, in one of his books said that if he had to summon the most horrific death penalty he could, it would be to banish somebody to the Solomon Islands. It's just, nothing good's coming. We decided we're going to go and we're going to make a stand. August the 7th, 1942, 8 months to the day of Pearl Harbor. An invasion force carrying 11,000 Marines. I think it's 45 ships. The Quincy is one of them. They come around, they catch the Japanese completely by surprise. There's basically a small garrison of construction workers and a few combat troops and a few engineering troops, but they catch them completely by surprise. And the Quincy fires the first rounds on the invasion of Guadalcanal. Here she is. This is taken that day. This smoke is from a bomber that was shot down. This is the last picture of her taken during daytime. When the Japanese hear that Guadalcanal has been attacked, their reaction was, okay, well, enough of that. It won't take long to get rid of them. They report to the emperor, and the courier or the general telling the emperor says, nothing to worry about, Your Highness. They'll be gone in a couple of days. Knee-jerk reaction, they launch an air attack. And they send over, on August 7th, they send over 27 bombers and some fighter planes to hit the transports to drive off the Americans. One thing the Japanese constantly did, at least in most of the Guadalcanal campaign, was they underestimate the American strength. They were so used to just steamrolling over everybody. So they told the emperor, don't worry about it. They send over 27 bombers. The bombers do minimal damage. 16 of them are shot down because the ships are ready. And they're circling, they've got anti-aircraft fire. And this is not what the Japanese Air Force is used to. Well, who tipped off the Americans if the Japanese are coming from way up here? There are coast watches. This fellow is Eric Clemens. He is Oxford educated. He was managing a Copra plantation in Guadalcanal. He was also the district commissioner. When the Japanese started taking over island after island, there were fellows like him who had powerful radios, and they would go further and further into the bush, and they would monitor air traffic and send transmissions to Australia. So he was basically eyes on the ground. And he sees these aircraft headed down the slot, and they sent a note, they sent a message so that the Americans are ready. These were his men. There were a number of them, and some of them were killed by the Japanese, but they were all over these islands. And there's a book called The Coast Watchers, and it's really an excellent story. The Japanese send another air attack the next day. They send 44 bombers down. They do a little bit of damage. They send a set of transport on fire, and they damage a destroyer pretty significantly. But of the 44, only 8 bombers make it back. But the Japanese send a surface force of 7 cruisers and 1 destroyer down, and these guys are going to take care of the situation. It is highly, highly aggressive. It's a bold maneuver. They leave the islands, they leave their bases up here, and they're coming down through this narrow strip here, and they're going to get to Guadalcanal late the night of the 8th. As they leave their bases, they are spotted by an American submarine. But they're going so fast that the sub can't really accurately depict what the composition is. They just send a note, 8 ships headed south, traveling fast. They get a little bit further south, they're spotted by a plane, an Australian patrol plane. And the Japanese commander realizes they're spotted, and so he turns their course so that they look like they're not coming down. He turns and he heads them off this way up here. The pilot who reports this to the American fleet says he misdiagnoses the composition of the fleet. He says, well, 3 cruisers, 2 seaplane carriers, and a couple other ships. But the fact that they're turning away leads the Americans to think, oh, well, they're setting up a seaplane base at one of the smaller islands. So that's really not going to be, they're not headed towards Guadalcanal. They get down a little bit further, and they get spotted by another plane. And this plane, there's 2 stories as to what happened. The first story was the guy who the Australian pilot spots them. He doesn't break radio silence. He continues his route. He then goes back to his base, lands, has a cup of tea, and then he files a report. And that was one of the causes for things going wrong was, well, we never got the message. This guy never did his job. His family challenged that. Samuel Eliot Morrison was the professor Roosevelt appointed. He was a Harvard professor. Roosevelt says to Morrison, you're going to be the official Navy historian for World War II. Morrison buys into this thing. In the 60s, well, in the 80s and 90s, the Australian pilot's family proves he did everything he was supposed to. He filed a report, he broke radio silence, he didn't even finish his route. He went back and he told them once he landed. The message never got. It never got transferred to the ships. Japanese commander, Gunichi Mikawa, one tough, aggressive guy. Career Navy officer. He loved a couple things. He loved surface torpedoes, and he loved night fighting. He loved night maneuvers. He loved night tactics. Under his command, there was no weekend. There were 2 Fridays and 2 Mondays in every week. They were trained exhaustively. He loved torpedoes. He loved night fighting. This is his ship. This is the Chokai. This is a heavy cruiser, just like the Quincy is. But if you look at this superstructure, this is a massive amount of structure. She has 3 turrets of 2 guns each, and then 2 turrets aft. These little things right here, these are actually white canvas shrouds, and those contain the torpedoes. The Chokai is headed down, she's the flagship. Mikawa is in charge of this strike force. This is another cruiser. This is the Aoba. She has torpedoes. She's a little bit less tonnage than the Quincy, but she's respectable. Oh, one other thing. This huge superstructure, the British and the naval architects at the time in the late 30s and early 40s said, you know what? They're going to be unseaworthy. They're going to be top heavy. They'll capsize. And so, I mean, everything, we had an answer for everything. This is another Japanese cruiser. This is the Furutaka, surface torpedoes. This is it. This is a surface torpedo. It was captured, failed to detonate. The warhead, the explosive component of this torpedo, 1,090 pounds. It's oxygen propelled. I don't know the technique, but with the oxygen propelled torpedoes, they could go faster, they could go further, and the design of the torpedoes left minimal wakes. This is what they call Type 93. They call it the Long Lance. The range of this torpedo, she could go 11 nautical miles at a speed of 49 knots, or 40,000 yards at 36 knots. Our torpedo could go 6,000 yards at 45 knots, shorter and slower, or 15,000 yards at even less speed. And our torpedoes had lousy depth control settings. They had flimsy contact exploders, and they would sometimes explode prematurely. So, it was really not a good weapon. This was the weapon. They're headed south. Just before, early on the day of the 8th, the American commanding officer calls a conference. And he calls the commanding officer of the Australia group, these ships here, and the commanding officer, just the commanding officer of the Australia group. And he says, come on south, we're going to have a conference down here. Well, rather than take a slower boat, the captain of the Australia pulls his whole ship out of formation and heads down for the conference. Nobody tells anybody that he's gone, except he tells the captain of the Chicago, the next ship, I'm going to a meeting. You lead this patrol. But nobody up here knows about that. The Japanese are going to come down and they want to enter the channel either here or here. To prevent them, we have a destroyer, the Blue, and another destroyer, the Ralph Talbot. And these two destroyers are patrolling back and forth to protect the northern entrances. The transports are down here and down here. As the Japanese are getting closer and closer, they launch scout planes to fly ahead and reconnoiter the area. And the scout planes arrive, and they go over these ships here, and they arrive, and they're circling over the transports. And they drop flares, and these flares light up the sky. Before the flares were dropped, here's an example of people not wanting to recognize what's happening. I interviewed a guy who said, I know of a guy who was topside. He was by one of the number 2 stack, and he saw the running lights of a plane flying over. And he said to the officer next to him, he said, "Sir, those are aircraft flying." And the officer goes, "No, you're confused. There wouldn't be any aircraft here. You're listening to the sound of the blowers." When the Japanese ships do enter the harbor, one of the ships down here, over here, said, there's 6 ships headed this way. And the officer of the deck says, "No, I don't think so." And he says, "Yeah." He says, "The radars picked him up." And the officer said, "Well, no, those aren't ships. Those are little islands." And the seaman goes, "Well, sir, with all due respect, those islands are headed our way at 26 knots." But here it is. They don't, you don't want to. No, it can't be that. They can't do that. That's not going to happen. The Japanese get in here. They're entering, and the Japanese are thunderstruck because nobody's picked them up. Nobody sees what's going on. They're coming down here, and they see the 2 ships, and the 2 ships are going back and forth, back and forth. At their furthest point, they're 10 miles apart, and they're headed this way and this way. And the Japanese ships are coming straight down this way. And every gun is trained on either one of these ships. Makawa says, "Slow down." They cut the speed from 29 knots to like 25 knots. And they're just they're just wondering why nobody's blowing the whistle. Neither of the destroyers pick up on these ships. They get a little closer, and they see another ship. And this ship is headed across this way here. And this ship is a destroyer. It's the Jarvis, USS Jarvis. The Jarvis was one of the few ships severely damaged by the air attacks. What happened was her orders were, try to make it to Australia for repairs, but don't go without an escort. Well, she's got no communication system. Half of her weaponry is gone. She basically, well, who knows why, but her commanding officer said, "No, I'm going to go." So the Jarvis, again, the Japanese are looking at her, crossing their path, and nothing happens. So she heads that way. They're coming into the Sound. It's 6 minutes, it's 6 minutes of 1 in the morning. Japanese enter between the Blue and the Ralph Talbot. Over here, at 1:34, the Jarvis is limping off to the west. At 1:43 in the morning, the Patterson, a destroyer over here, sends out a signal. Warning, warning, strange ships entering harbor. Some of the other ships pick up on it. Some of the other ships don't hear it because the radio waves are full of, they're trying to maintain position. They're trying to keep in formation. The warning doesn't really serve any purpose. It's 1:43. 1:43 in the morning, the Canberra. The Japanese see the Canberra. She's sighted by the Chokai at 1:38. The range is 5,000 yards. The Japanese are closing at 26 knots. 5,000 yards, 26 knots, it's a collision course. Scout planes have dropped flares. At 1:43, the Canberra is hit by 2 torpedoes. That is followed by 2 salvos from 5 of the Japanese ships. She suffers 24 hits. She loses all power. She has a 30-degree list. She's dead in the water in 6 minutes. What is incredible is the next ship is the Chicago. The Canberra was out of position, so she gets hit first. The next ship is an American cruiser, the Chicago. Her captain is the guy, Captain Bode, B-O-D-E. Not necessarily a nice guy, a real Napoleonic type complex. Annapolis, supposedly married into the DuPont family. He is in command of the Chicago. He gets hit She gets hit in the bow by a torpedo, blows half her bow off. He veers off to the left, completely the wrong direction. Meanwhile, the Japanese are coming like this. He doesn't say anything to these guys. Nobody communicates what's going on here with these guys except for the Patterson. The Japanese now come down here. The Chicago veers off to the left, away from the battle. That's going to haunt him. This is the chart. So McCowell's force comes in, they hit the Chicago, they hit the Canberra, and then they split. And they're going in two different directions. One direction goes here, one direction goes here. This is the northern group, the Quincy, the Vincennes, and the Astoria. This is, I'm just going to read chronologically how things are going south so quickly. At 1:50, the Quincy, Vincennes, and Astoria are being illuminated by searchlights from Japanese cruisers. At first, commanding officer of the Quincy felt these lights were from Allied ships to the south who were lighting up a surface Japanese submarine. The Quincy rangefinders, they measured the distance to the nearest ship, which was 8,400 yards, the exact distance to the Japanese cruiser Aoba. The Quincy is going from it was called Condition Z. It was a partially complete battle stations. Half the guns were maintained. The other half of the gunners were on. They were allowed to relax. These ships had been on combat alert since, say, 6 o'clock in the morning on the 7th. It's now early in the morning of the 9th. They're exhausted. They are tired. At 1:52 and a half, she's hit aft on the main deck, knocking out number 3, one of the small 4-barreled anti-aircraft guns. 30 seconds later, she's hit on the bridge. 1 minute later, she's hit on the port side, putting anti-aircraft guns number 6 and 8 out of action. Ammunition for guns number 2 and 4 is exploding because of they had ammunition for the guns stored right out in the open. So if you had a hit here, it was very likely this would go off. And so within 1.5 minutes, the entire port side battery is gone. Gunners are completely decimated. 1:55, she's hit by a salvo from the Aoba. Fire breaks out on the aircraft stored on the deck. These aircraft, canvas bodies, they're on the deck. They're also on the catapults. They're full of fuel, all of which is highly flammable. Stuff was just lying around, kerosene, solvents, everything. Fires start on the boat deck, on the planes. Now you have an inferno. The Japanese don't need a searchlight. You can see, and the fires are taking over control. 1:59, Quincy fires her first salvo of all 9 guns at one of the cruisers. It's short. At 2 o'clock, turret number 3, the main turret aft, is hit by a shell from the Furutaka. It is unable to train because, these turrets rotate on a turret mechanism, ball bearings, if you will. A piece of shrapnel gets lodged in the ball bearing mechanism. So this turret is locked in this position. She can't fire at anything other than, that's all. So that whole turret, 1/3 of her major armament is useless. Her port side is completely dead. There's no capabilities there. 2 o'clock, 2 minutes later, the other ships on the southern force and the north, they're just firing point blank. It's just bedlam. She's starting to lose speed. She's only going 26 knots now. She fires a salvo again from turrets number 1 and 2. She's still short. 4 minutes past 2, she's hit on the port side by 2 torpedoes. One hit near the central station in the internal control room. The second was in the after 2 fire rooms, the boiler rooms. All personnel within these areas are killed. At 2:05, Quincy finally hits, they hit the flagship. They hit the Chokoi. They kill about 30 men. The hit that they make on the Chokai, if it was, they figured it out, if it was like 15 feet later, it would have killed McCullough and all his command staff. Just luck. Things are getting worse and worse. By 2:06, she's hit on the side of the bridge. The pilot house, everybody in the pilot house is dead, all of the occupants. Turret number 1 and turret number 2 are getting hit. Fires caused turret number 1 to be abandoned. 2 minutes later, turret number 2 explodes. Everybody within's killed. It's just, fire room number 2, water rising in one of the boiler rooms is causing the boilers to be shut. She's got no propulsion. She's listing. She's got no weaponry. The ship is completely, totally on fire. Her command staff is killed, and it's just the only reason there's no more punishment is because the Japanese are now leaving. They want to get out of there. They want to hightail out of there. And they're headed back north because what the Japanese don't want to have happen is to be in this area in daylight because of the fear of American carriers. So they want to head home. Now, it turns out the American carriers, the one source of air defense for us, left because the admiral in charge of the carriers, Fletcher, did not want to risk losing any more carriers. So he allegedly said, well, we're low on fuel, we got to kind of get away. Well, when he pulls the carriers out, what he in effect is doing is he's leaving the troops without their supplies, without their ammunition, because the transports weren't unloaded. And so the carriers leave, the transports leave, and there were a lot of very, very irate Marines on this scenario. I mean, there was a lot of ill feeling here. 2:20 in the morning, she's listing heavily to port. Her forecastle's awash, water's rising over the gun deck. Fires raging all over. She's carrying out orders to abandon ship. This is not a good shot. I got to get rid of this one because, it says enemy torpedoes spread, possibly submarine. There were no submarines involved. They were all surface torpedoes. Here's the Quincy in peacetime. Let's see. All of the green were hits from the starboard side, and they were major hits. All of the red were hits from the port side. There is no safe place on her. This is a drawing. Well, these circles and these blotches show every hit she took. I have this. Ed's going to remind me to show. I have a map of that you can look at. I always forget to show it. Here she is. She's down by the stern. She's completely on fire. This is the last known picture of her. And she sinks at 2:30. The water was about 3,000 feet deep. This is an artist's conjecture of her loss, the torpedo hole, people just, going into the water. August 9th, 1942 is when she sank. The Navy Department, excuse me, in connection with the loss of the Quincy, the Bureau of Ships states the damage to the Quincy was so extensive that its loss was inevitable, that it is not possible for any lightly protected vessel to absorb such punishment and survive. The Bureau also stated that fires were a major contributing factor. She received 36 8-inch, 5-inch, and 4.7-inch hits with a possibility of not less than 18 more, a total of 54 hits. She also received 3 torpedo hits. Letters. This is Lieutenant Byron Beerer. He was the supply officer. He was Annapolis, class of 26. he survived the ship. The first 7 highest officers on the Quincy were all killed. The senior surviving officer was the gunnery officer. He was number 8. Lieutenant Beerer here was probably number 11 or 12. This is his letter to his wife, dated October the 16th, 1942. What happened was, this was such an embarrassing defeat that the Navy Department kept a lid on it until October. Almost to the effect that, well, we're not going to give you the bad news until we have some good news. And there was a huge outcry against that policy. My dear, so that's why his letter is dated October the 16th. That's when it hit the papers. My dearest Mary, you've read by now what happened to my ship. I saw it announced a few days ago. It was quite something. I don't want to have to go through such again. I was extremely fortunate, to say the least. The ship was torn to pieces and a fire in a great many places. I did not so much receive a scratch. My battle station was the radio room, which was amazingly little damaged. However, when we attempted to leave it after the firing ceased, we found the only exit was jammed. I managed within a few minutes to attract the attention. He frees it up and everything. I organized the people with me in an attempt to fight fires and assist wounded, but could do little for lack of water and other reasons. The ship all this time being listed to port about 10 degrees. We did release a life raft, which was the only undamaged one remaining. By this time, practically everyone able to had abandoned the ship, except myself and 7 men with me. Many badly wounded and burned. We had to leave as we could do nothing for them. When we tried, when we tried to help those burned, the flesh came off in our hands. However, I stayed as long as I could, doing what I could, which was pitifully little. At length, the ship rolled over to port. I ordered the few remaining men to leave the ship and saw them into the water. He goes on to say how basically he organized the men and they tied together a couple of rafts. They took empty shell casings. You could use that, hang onto that as a flotation device. So he goes on and just talks about the ship sinking. Now, this is a letter from a woman that was to Ed Cabral. Cabral was in the engine room. This is dated May 7th, 1945. I mean, 3.5 years after. Mr. Cabral, I received your address from your father. If you could, I wish you would write to me. If you can't, well, I will understand you couldn't. What I want to find out is, did you see a chief on the Quincy by the name of Brittenback? You were about the last one off the ship, and when I read the clipping in the paper, I waited. But maybe if you could now tell me anything, you would. He was a chief water tender. They used to call him Brit. I used to go around with him. The Navy said he was missing. His mother and folks live in Brooklyn. He was supposed to have turned back to save a fireman on the ship. Could you tell me anything about him? If you could, I would more than appreciate it. Wishing you the very best of luck and thanking you. I remain, sincerely, Laura Walsh. He went down with the ship. Casualties. This is page 1 of the casualty list for the men lost on the ship or wounded. And there are various codes. If you were just wounded, you were 0700. If you were killed in action, excluding air combat, you were 0121. And it goes on and on. If you were presumed killed in action, and it's been more than a year since you've been missing, you were 6221s. So, you know, the military has systems for everything. Here's the name, your service number, your rating, status, 0700 wounded. August 9th, 1942. Mueller, John Conrad, 6221, 8/10/43. In other words, they would wait a year before they would classify you as dead. The casualty list for the Quincy was 15 pages long. This is the captain, Samuel Moore. He's from Detroit, commanding officer, Annapolis. Went down with the ship. There was a Marine patrol on Guadalcanal about 10 days after the ship went down, and they came across some natives, and one of the natives is wearing an Annapolis class ring. And they go, "Where'd you get the ring?" And they said, "Well," they told them it was off a body that washed ashore. And they said, "Well, where's the body?" And the natives, they led him to the gravesite. This is Dorvis Allen. He was 24 years old. He was from Warrenton, Georgia. If you were African American and went into the Navy at that time, your choices of employment were pretty limited. You could be a steward, you could be an officer's cook, you could be a messmate. You could have very, very few choices of what you wanted to do. He was killed. He was below decks, ammunition passer. This is Donald Brusso. He's from Fairfax, Vermont. He was a gunner's mate. He was in turret number 2. He was lost. This is, to me, this is so touching. It's a letter from the Navy Department to Donald Brusso's mother. "My dear Mrs. Brusso, this will acknowledge your letter of November 30th, in which you request further information concerning your son Donald Raymond Brusso, boatswain's mate, 2nd class. It is with deepest regret that the Bureau must inform you that there is no further information available at this time. Your son is still missing, da-da-da-da-da-da." I mean, can you imagine how many letters like that? You know, I mean, thousands. I interviewed a woman, she was a civilian. Her job was to send out the notifications for officers killed or missing in action. And she said, I couldn't do it. She said, it was just, you know, a tidal wave. One weekend, she said, we did nothing but send out telegrams. A young seaman from Philadelphia, lost on the Quincy. Seaman from North Carolina, lost on the Quincy. Here's the date, October the 14th. Now here they say, U.S. forces sink big Jap, blah, blah, blah. But over here is a small article about the 4 cruisers lost. Same thing here. And here on the editorial, they say, hey, you can't keep the bad news just because you don't have any good news. When word reached the shipyard, the Quincy was lost, they said, let's name another ship Quincy. So they took a ship that was well underway, construction. This was going to be the St. Paul, and they made this be the Quincy. So she was much more successful. She carried Roosevelt to Yalta. She was at Normandy. And I don't know if she was in Tokyo for the surrender, but she ended up in the Pacific. Bob Ballard is the guy who I think discovered the Lusitania or the Titanic, you know, the underwater explorer. He did a survey of ships in Guadalcanal in the 90s. And here's the Quincy today. Here's her bow, or her command, there's the bridge, the pilot house. You can see some of the stuff's knocked out, the windows and everything is totally covered with crustaceans. And here's turret number 2. This barrel exploded. These are the anti-aircraft guns that were at the very, very back. The decks buckle, they're just pointing up. These were knocked out within the first minute of the battle. A 5-inch gun, none of them fired any rounds. These are the guns that were being installed at the very, very top. This was a communication dome that when the ship went down, the water pressure forced her up. Buckled deck, here's turret number 3. Just, destruction. Here's the back. There's the jackstaff for the flag. Here's her propeller. Yeah, there's the stern. This is an artist's drawing of what she looks like. The bow's gone. Everything over in here is gone. The stacks are gone. Buckle stern. Peacetime, the last picture, and at the bottom. And that concludes my talk on the Quincy. So, yes, hopefully somebody has questions.
If you have a question, we would like you to use the mic. And Ed, you've got a mic at your end?
That's
Okay.
not working.
Darn.
I can speak up.
Okay,
Speak loud.
try it.
I can repeat it.
Okay.
Two questions. First of all, that night, what were the conditions? Was there moon? Was there fog? Or was it pitch black and
Yep,
you could
okay.
only see with it?
First question was, what was the weather like? What was visibility like? There were some showers,
Yeah.
a lot of cloud coverage, no moon, fairly low seas, fairly tranquil water. The visibility was not that good.
Okay. And the follow-up was, what did the Navy do then to prevent this from recurring?
Okay. Number one, something this bad, somebody's going to pay the price. So there was an investigation. In retrospect, there were a lot of survivors from this engagement. Okay, 4 Allied cruisers are lost, but there were people who abandoned ship, went into the water, but they got picked up. They were rescued. So you get everybody together, you piece together the story so you can find out what happened or what you think happened. And they're fairly accurate at doing that. The consensus was by the Navy Department, look, if we get rid of everybody that blew it here, if we get rid of everybody that mishandled the situation, there's going to be nobody left. The commanders of the Vincennes and the Astoria, basically their careers are over. One of them was assigned to like the recruiting office in Waco, Texas. And the other one was sent, I don't know, they were done. The guy that took a fall, if you will, was Bodie, the captain of the Chicago. And where things went wrong with him was he could have communicated to the Northern force what was going on at the very beginning of the attack. He didn't. And number two, when he veered his ship away, that was bad form. That was almost construed as cowardice. So he was interviewed, and the final day of the interview, he just took a gun and killed himself. Now, lessons. These ships were not lost so much because of a lack of watertight integrity. They were lost because fires were out of control. The reason fires were out of control was they had very, very primitive firefighting techniques. You know, you see firemen with hoses with big spray nozzles now that'll smell. These were just like garden hoses, thicker, but the mains and the risers, once they got knocked out, that was it. There was nothing. So there was no way to fight the fires with the prevailing firefighting technique and equipment they had. In addition to that, the reason the fires were everywhere was because of poor discipline, because of poor organization. The planes never should have been left on the catapults. Everything should have been put away, the kerosene, the lubricants, the fuel. The paint. Quincy was launched in '36. She had probably been painted internally 3 or 4 times anyway. Well, that paint's on the bulkheads. That's flammable. A lot of the Japanese armament was incendiaries the size of grape nuts, and they'd scatter, and so the fires really were spreading. Communications. The communication system, ship between ship, was archaic. They beefed that up. The the battle organization, not half, a significant number of men on the Quincy never got to their battle station because your job might be as a yeoman in this office here, 3 decks down, and your battle station might be on the number 2 anti-aircraft gun. You know, you couldn't get there. By the time you tried to get there, all the doors are shut and watertight and everything. So the Navy looked at the how you organize your crew for battle stations. There are a lot of lessons learned.
I think the mic is working now.
How did you,
Just speak loud.
how did you become interested in the Quincy?
Question was, how did I become interested in the Quincy? Grew up in Maine, always loved going to Portland to see ships coming into the state pier and going on board them and everything. And I just love seeing these large ships, large warships. And we were living in an apartment building, humble origin, I could say, without embellishing. And there was a fellow who lived, there were 3 apartments on the floor, and this fellow had 2 fingers missing from his right hand. And I don't know, I was probably 10 or 11. And, you know, he was old. I mean, he might have been 40, you know. And, you know, you're a kid, everybody's old. So I said to him, I said, "Hey, mister, how'd you lose your fingers?" And he goes, "You know," he says, I don't know. He says, "I was on a ship in the Navy," and he says, "I went to bed and everything was fine, and then I woke up, there was a huge explosion and 2 of my fingers were missing." I go, "Wow." You know. Anyway, I just kind of loved getting into naval history. And the thing about the Quincy is this same story could be about the Vincennes or the Astoria or the Canberra. And it was an embarrassment. It was a colossal bunch of mistakes. And, you know, these guys did what they could. So I have a, oh boy. I have a note that I do want to close with. I can take more questions while I'm looking for this. Yes, Will.
I have a, okay,
What?
my question is relative to radar. Now, radar has been around since like 1939, I think 1940.
Yeah.
When the Quincy was retrofitted in 42, didn't they have downsized radars where it could fit on a ship?
They were modifying it. They were. I think it was really rudimentary. The radar on the Quincy. It wasn't a factor on the Quincy. Now, some of the.
If it was there, why not? My question.
Well, I think part of it was even with working sets, they tended to discount it. I think it was somewhat of a clash of cultures. It had nowhere near the acceptance and the prominence that it was to get. Now, as shortly thereafter in the Guadalcanal campaign, they did start to realize its merits. You know, this was the first of 7 major naval battles at Guadalcanal. This was just the beginning. The Japanese nor the Americans, nobody anticipated the ferocity, the extent, the severity of what this island was going to cost. It was threefold. There was the battle in the air between the Japanese aircraft and the American, the battle at sea, and the battle at shore. I'm just looking for one thing. I got it. Will, you had a question.
Hello.
Okay, well, actually, George is next and then Will.
I got to talk to Will, yeah. George.
Is that all right?
Yes, sir.
Let me add one bit of information for you.
Absolutely.
In 1938, the U.S. Navy put out a request if anyone had any ideas on how to put out an oil fire at sea. That was responded to by a young man by the name of Freeman from Worcester, who was a recent graduate of Worcester Polytech.
Did you go to WPI? Is that him? That's Mr. Freeman.
That's Mr. Freeman, okay.
Okay, good for you. Did you go to WPI?
No, I did not, but he was my business associate.
See, you never know who's in the audience.
So to finish the story for everyone else, a Lend-Lease ship was on fire off of Newfoundland in 1939. They called Howard to see if he still had the valves he supplied. He did. They loaded him on a plane, took him up to Newfoundland, put him on board the ship, and it was the first time they'd successfully extinguished an oil fire at sea. Those valves are still the designs that you find on all Navy ships to this day. And they are the most efficient to atomize seawater. So, but I'm glad to see you have that.
I gave this talk at Worcester Polytech. Boy, I can't believe it. Seriously. Thank you. Where's Will?
Here, Will, take that.
I was asking you this earlier. I think I have a loud enough voice.
That's okay.
I have a pretty loud voice. Okay, I wanted to ask. I had a cousin who was on the San Francisco, and he was in. They used to call it Iron Bottom Bay. So many ships.
Yes,
sailed
sir.
There.
Yep.
And I don't remember when it was, but I wondered if you knew when the San Francisco was there in the series of battles.
She was there. She was. I think her first engagement was early November. It was called Black Friday, November 13th, and she took a lot of casualties. She did not sink, but she got pounded.
Or was she there at this time?
No, she wasn't. No, she wasn't at the Battle of Sable Island.